It's in part 2 of Descartes' Discourse on Method where he's actually going to outline for us his 4 rules of method, the Cartesian methodology, which is not only useful for philosophy, but Descartes would say for practically anything if the goal is to actually attain knowledge, something reliable, a foundation that we can depend upon. Before that, he's going to give us this metaphor of the city, and it's well worth keeping in mind because it helps to illuminate how his project is supposed to work, particularly when we think about part 3 and the provisional morality, but also the motivation that he has for doing what he's doing. We saw that in part 1, he was unhappy or discontent with what it was that the sciences that he had been studying, mostly out of books from instructors, had been claiming to provide him with knowledge. He said, they don't actually provide us with knowledge that I can depend upon. They provide us with what looks like knowledge, but since this person over here is saying one thing and this person over here is saying another thing, they can't both be correct at the same time, and maybe both of them are wrong. Now, the idea that he's got is, let's begin anew. Let's start afresh. We're going to sweep away everything that we've got and figure out what we can rely on and build up from that. But how's he going to get there? He starts out by talking about cities, and I think we can all relate to this. You could also think about university campuses. You could also think about old houses. He's got the example of legal systems. I think we've all run across laws that seem a little weird to us, and we're like, why is that still on the books? So here's the basic idea. Products that are made by more than one planner are going to be less rational because they represent the initiatives and the desires and the plans of more than one agent, more than one person. And they have to work together either by accumulation or by committee, and it never really turns out the way that we want it. If we want a rational product, what we need is one single planner. Or if there were going to be multiple people, they all need to be on the same page, as we say. They all need to have the same values. They all need to have the same method. They all have to have the same basic idea about what they're trying to accomplish. And this could apply to a lot of different things. Think about when you have a musical act. Is it good to have a number of different people trying to write a song? Should the entire band try to write the song? Probably not going to turn out quite so good as when one person is the one determining, the one person ruling, the one person in charge. Now, what are old cities like? If you've ever been to an old city, they're not laid out on a grid pattern, right? But, I'm from the Midwest, so a lot of our towns and cities are actually laid out on a grid. So if usually the numbered streets go north-south or east-west. Like in Milwaukee, for example, before you leave the numbered streets, if you have a numbered street, you can know how far west or how far east you are. And then I suppose if you know where all the other streets run, you can know how far south or north you are. In Chicago, the numbered streets go the other way. But then you get to the parts of the city that are older. And there the streets run kind of crooked. And you're like, why does this street go this way and then start going over that way? New York City is a great example. Most of the avenues run straight. Broadway doesn't. Why doesn't Broadway run straight? Well, because it was there before. Here in the city of Kingston, where I live, there's a lot of streets that are a little bit too narrow for the cars that have to get through. Why is that? They were originally horse roads. And the buggies were narrower than the kind of vehicles that we use today. And the houses were built there a long time ago, and they ain't moving those houses, so that's what we've got. So we have, irrational city design, Descartes says. And although the parts of the city may be really nice, as a whole, as a composition, it's not very rational. It's not very coherent. It doesn't work very well. Think about traffic, If you've ever been stuck in traffic jams in major cities and you're like, why don't they expand the roads? There's nowhere to expand them to. And where would they run? That's one of the fundamental problems. Now, one way that you can deal with that is by tearing everything down and beginning again. Why would you want to do that? Well, you can only put new stuff onto old stuff for so long before you've got these weird accumulations that are all jury-rigged and don't really work efficiently. So why not just begin anew? You know, like let's say you bought an old house, right? One of the things you're going to want in your new house that is an old house is good Wi-Fi and enough electrical outlets and reliable plumbing. Probably issue around here would be furnaces too. You're probably going to want natural gas instead of heating oil, because heating oil is very unpredictable in cost, except for the one thing that you can predict, that it's going to cost you a lot. So you have to retrofit. Do you really want to retrofit this, or would it be more cost effective just to bulldoze the whole thing and then build a new house? One that you know is up to specs. One that you can expand on if you need to. So knowledge works like that too. Descartes is saying that all of the previous knowledge up until his time, the stuff that he studied as a child, that he studied in university, is really a product of many people. All their opinions have been accumulated over the year, like houses and roads getting placed willy-nilly in an old city. Not actually totally random. It made sense at the time that this house should go over here and that that street should run that way. But as the centuries proceed, the rationale gets lost. And after a while you're like, this doesn't make any sense. Why are you doing things this way? We could think the same thing about customs. We could think the same thing even about languages. We could think this about a lot of different things. In any case, the metaphor is we're going to have to tear some things down and build anew. Now, there's one thing that you have to do, and I didn't put this on the board, that's kind of common sense. But I suppose a lot of people don't have quite that much common sense, or they're not exercising it, because you see these kind of things on bloopers and YouTube and shows where people do crazy and stupid things. If you're going to demolish your house, you probably want to make sure that while the new house is being built, you have some place to stay. Or if you're going to knock down, 3/4 of the city, you better keep one part of the city where you can actually live and carry on your normal day-to-day activities. That's going to be, in part, these rules of method, and also Descartes' provisional morality. Those are the parts that you're going to live in until you can find something better, something that is actually more rational. Now, how can we find something that would be more rational? Descartes gives us a method here. He says, I thought that instead of coming up with a whole bunch of rules, I would have enough with the 4 following rules, provided that I maintained a strong and constant resolution. I would never fail to observe them, not even once. So once a method, according to Descartes, once a method is adopted, you got to stick with it, or it's not really going to be an effective method. You want to avoid what he calls irresolution, that is, wavering or making exceptions. So what are the rules? Let's run through all of them, and then let's look at each one of them in turn. So I've rephrased them slightly, but these are still faithful to what he's saying. First rule is don't accept anything as true that isn't clear and distinct, or that you could doubt. That's probably a good rule of thumb, but it's violated so often by most people, including myself, that it is something that you would have to have as a rule. You would have to say, I am not going to accept anything unless I can be sure that it's actually true. How can you be sure that it's actually true? You have a clear and distinct conception of it. And that doesn't mean that you feel like you have a clear and distinct conception. That means that you can actually provide a rational account of it. If it's something that can be called into doubt, then it's not true. If it could be wrong, it's not true. It's only things that we can be completely sure about that we can say are true. That's the first rule of the method. Second rule of the method, break matters down into simpler parts and study those simple parts. Third part goes along with this. After you've actually broken the thing down into its simpler parts and you've got them all laid out in front of you, start with the simplest parts and then gradually build them back up into more complex wholes. Finally, keep complete records of what you're doing. As he says, here's the verbiage that he has. I was to make my calculations throughout so complete and my review so general I would be confident of not omitting anything. This is like checking your work when you're doing math problems or proofreading your papers. Look at what you've done and make sure you didn't leave anything out. Keep track of things. It'll be a hell of a lot easier the next time when you have to do the same thing if you've actually got the procedure down. And if somebody else has to come behind you and clean up the mess that you made, at least they'll have records of what you've done. One of the worst things is when you have a filing system that's just totally crazy because it's idiosyncratic and nobody can figure out what to do with it when the person who has the filing system disappears. Now, these 4 rules can be applied to all sorts of things. Descartes is going to apply them to metaphysics. And that's pretty cool. We all should spend some time doing some metaphysics. But I think it might be easier to wrap your head around it if we think of more mundane circumstances. So let's think, for example, about self-diagnosis. We have WebMD, and WebMD gets lots of people into trouble. You wake up one morning and you call in sick to work and you really do feel bad. And you're like, oh, I've got this sore throat and I'm tired and I feel like I'm going to throw up. I wonder if I have the bubonic plague. Now, that's one where you could, pretty easily eliminate it if you know much about the plague because you don't have any, pustules or things like that. But let's say that you're a hypochondriac. Well, do you know that you've got the plague? Let's go to WebMD. And what does WebMD actually do? Well, what is a diagnosis? A diagnosis breaks things down. It carries out an analysis, and it says, if you have this disease, here's the symptoms. Here's symptom 1, here's symptom 2, here's symptom 3, here's symptom 4. And in order for you to qualify as having this disease, you need 3 out of 4 of these symptoms for at least 2 days, right? So that's breaking it down into its simpler parts. Once you've broken it down into those simple parts, you can ask yourself, do I have this symptom? I do have a sore throat. Do I have this symptom? I do feel nauseous. Do I have this symptom? Do I have, whatever the bubonic plague pustules are called, buboes or something like that? No, I don't have that. Do I have this? Do I have the bacteria in my system? No, I don't have that. Well, then you don't have the plague, right? Problem solved. If you break problems down into their constituent parts, it's a lot easier to examine those parts separately from each other, deal with each of them separately, and then if there's something still yet to put back together, then you build it back on up. Now, if you do have those, symptoms of bubonic plague, oh, you better go to the doctor because you're going to die if you don't, probably, right? I don't know what the mortality rate is of plague today, but I imagine it's pretty high. That would be this other level. We had analysis here, then you have synthesis here. And then, keeping complete records. We could do this for all sorts of other things. Think about couples counseling. Imagine I'm a couples counselor. I have 2 people who come to me, and whenever there's people going into couples counseling, it's not because everything's going great and they're on the same page and they have the exact same story about the relationship. As a matter of fact, if they do in fact have the same story about the relationship and they're in couples counseling, probably it's because one of them has browbeaten the other one into accepting their narrative. Well, let's say we got 2 people, a husband and a wife, and they're arguing with each other. He does this, she does that, he's got this wrong, she's got this wrong. Well, one of the things I would do is say, look, I don't actually know either one of you that well. I'm going to suspend belief in the things that you are saying until I have some evidence that it's actually the case. So if you're saying that he's always interrupting you, I'm going to watch you guys, and I'm going to see if he does in fact always interrupt you. And if he doesn't, I'm going to call BS on you and say that that's not actually true. And then we'll work from there. And you're saying that she's always nagging you. I'm going to check this out myself. I'm not just going to take your word for it, because you might actually be completely deluded about that. Let me watch this, and I'll observe your interactions. And then, how do you go further with this? Do you look at just the whole couple together? No, you take each one and you look at, well, what are your problems and how, what's your life experience and how did you screw yourself up and how did other people screw you up? And you over here, what's your story? And you deal with them to some degree in isolation from each other. And you do the same thing with the problems that come up. Because, one of the big issues in any sort of, interpersonal communication is people will lump together all sorts of other things. Well, I did this because he did that. Well, you know what? Him doing that is one thing. You doing this is another thing. If you're doing a jerky thing over here, we'll look at that jerky thing in isolation from him being a jerk over there. Finally, we start building things back up once we've got them put together. And then we keep records. You keep notes from session to session so that you actually know what happened in the last session. Then when you see them a week from now, after you've seen 10 other couples, you're like, all right, Jim and Susie. Okay, so Jim is doing this sort of stuff. How's that going? Susie's doing this sort of stuff. How's that going? Any progress? Let's take a look at it. And then you can go through the whole thing again. These are, ways of thinking about matters. Let's take one other example just off the top of my head. Let's use a culinary example. So you're trying to make some recipe, right? And you're not quite sure what it involves, but you've had something like it at the restaurant. I'm actually going to skip over the clear and distinct part here. And we're going to think about the analysis and synthesis. So you want to recreate a recipe. And you have enough culinary knowledge to know that, look, it's going to have this ingredient and that ingredient and this ingredient and that ingredient. And you got to figure out just how much of that to put in. Well, you look at, what did I actually taste? How did it come across to me? You abstract from the other things. How much sweetness was in that? That might tell you how much lemon juice to put in. Lemons, by the way, have sweetness as well as sourness. And then you build it back up. Now you taste it. How does it taste? And if you're smart, you actually keep some records about what you're doing so that you don't have to go back through the whole thing again. These are all sorts of examples that we can use of how you might apply the Cartesian method. We can think of the body this way. The body is a complex whole that can be broken down into its simpler parts. The circulatory system, the nervous system, the muscular system. Each muscle can be broken down into its fibers. Each muscle fiber can be broken down into its constituent cells. Each cell can be broken down further into all of the, I don't know what the parts of the cells are called, all the way down to the DNA, right? And we can put them back together, at least in our mind, when we're trying to figure out a problem. If you're doing a word problem in mathematics, you could apply the same thing here. Don't make big assumptions about what the problem is saying. Just stick with what is clear and distinct. Break it down into its simplest parts. Figure out what equations you need to work with. Put them back together. Solve the problem. Make sure to show your work along the way. Going back to the metaphor of the city, Descartes says that you can't tear down everything and then rebuild, because you need some place where you're going to live and carry out your day-to-day life. So besides the rules of method, he also thinks that there's a need to provide himself with a provisional morality. He says that I can use the method to examine my thoughts, my opinions on things, but I have to have some way of governing my actions until I've got all this figured out. And this applies both to his life after he's figured all these things out, and also to the years where he's gathering experience. Now, could this work for the rest of us? That's an interesting idea. This is essentially Cartesian ethics right here. His provisional morality is something that's supposed to be in place until he comes up with something better. He never really does produce an entire ethics the way that some thinkers did. He does provide something like that in parts of his other works, particularly on the passions of the soul. He says that I came up with 3 maxims. Now, when he talks about a maxim, what he means there is a rule for action, a rule that governs our behavior, a rule that we can use as like a principle or a guidepost. So do unto others as you would have others do unto you. That's an example of a maxim. These are all sort of rules along those lines. He's a little bit, tricky when it comes to language because technically speaking, a maxim should just be one rule, but he manages with each one of these to shove 2 or 3 separate rules in there. You could say, well, they all pertain to the same thing, but they don't really match that well. They don't mesh together as just one single subject. So I separated them out here. The first maxim, or the first set of maxims, has to do with how he should behave in relation to his environment, you could say. So he says, I'm going to obey the laws and customs of my country. I'm going to follow the rules, even if they're irrational. It is rational to follow them because it keeps you from running into trouble and it allows you to do the sorts of things that you want to spend your time on. And I'm going to follow the customs of the country that I'm in because they're the customs of the country that I'm in. So he says, I know that other people have other customs. The Persians, the Iranians, that is, or the Chinese, maybe their customs make just as much sense. But if I'm living in France, I'm going to follow the French customs. If I'm living in the Netherlands, then I'm going to follow the Dutch customs. So that's the first rule. The second rule would seem to fit in with that to a certain degree. France is a Catholic country, so it may as well be Catholic. But when Descartes goes to the Netherlands, he doesn't suddenly change his affiliation and quit being Catholic and become Protestant. He doesn't become a Calvinist the way that they were there. He says that I'm going to stick with the religion that I was raised up in. And practically speaking, this doesn't mean an awful lot for Descartes other than just not causing any real trouble with the church and doing a lot of talking about how his philosophy really is incompatible with Catholic doctrine. Because it doesn't appear that Descartes had a very profound religious life. He did believe in God, that's very clear, and he does have a role for God in his metaphysics, but he doesn't appear to have done an awful lot. Now, why would he then say, I'm going to stick with the religion that I was brought up with? Well, remember, Descartes thinks that religion is something supernatural, so it's above reason, and that was a way to sort of put it at a distance. This is also a way to put it at a distance. If you just, go along with things, don't raise any trouble about religious matters, even though your philosophy probably has a lot of implication for religious matters if you think about the rules of method, just let it go on like that, and then, it won't be any real problem for you. This is the one that's really interesting. He says, I'm going to govern myself according to the most moderate opinions. So I'm not going to just go along with any sort of custom. If there is a couple different possibilities, I'm going to go along with the one that's most moderate, the one that's in the middle of the road, the one that's not at extremes. Why? He says, these are the furthest removed from excess. They're commonly accepted and practiced by the most sensible of the people among whom I would be living. So he's not going to just take anybody or any sort of thing as his model. He's going to say, that guy over there seems to have his head on pretty good. I think I'll follow along with what he's doing. Because he seems to be, figuring things out, and his life seems to be going all right, and he's not getting in a lot of conflict with people. So he says, I chose the most moderate because these are the most convenient to practice. If you're not going to one extreme or going to another, it's a lot easier to get along with people and not to be bothered by them so you can get to your real business, which is building this whole new city up, right? And he says, excess is usually bad. And the other thing that's good is instead of going to one extreme or the other, if I'm going the wrong way by going the middle of the road, I'm at least just halfway from wherever I should be. Whereas if I go to this extreme and the truth is actually over here, I'm as far away as I can get. If I'm in the middle of the road if the middle of the road isn't the right place, at least I don't have so far to go once I discover what the truth is. So that's the first maxim. The second maxim might actually seem to contradict some of the things in the first maxim, but if you think it through, it doesn't. He's just talked about being moderate, right? So being middle of the road, and now he says, I got to be extreme. I got to be totally constant and resolute in my actions, even if it's like stuff that's doubtful. This even seems to go against the rule of method, doesn't it? The first rule. But it doesn't, because again, this is a provisional morality. The idea is we should be constant and resolute. Once we've decided on something, we follow through on that. Even if we weren't 100% sure about that, even if it was a doubtful opinion, we're going to treat it as if it was certain, as if we knew it 100%. Now, that doesn't mean that we just accept any sort of opinion. We should follow the most probable opinions. So, if we think that we're not 100% sure that drinking alcohol to excess could be bad for you because some people drink it, tons and tons and tons of liquor and beer and wine, and they seem to be just fine. It's still more probable than not that we shouldn't drink to excess because it probably is going to harm us. And once we've adopted that, even though it is doubtful, we're going to treat it as if it's certain. And we'll just stick to that rule and follow through on that. That would be one example about how he's doing that. Descartes has this great metaphor of, look, if you're stuck in a forest, you keep going straight. You don't go this way and then that way and change your mind and backtrack a bit, because if you do that, you're never going to get out of the forest. That's how people get lost. That's how people die. If you keep going straight, sooner or later, you're going to hit something. It might be the ocean, it might be the edge of the world, but at least you'll know where you are, right? So these maxims actually, they make sense. If the thing that you want to do is be moderate, the moderate opinion, he says, is the one that seems to be the most probable. Once you've adopted it, then you're kind of an extremist about being moderate, and you just follow through on that. Now, the third maxim, or set of maxims, here you can see that Descartes really is, in many respects, a neo-Stoic. That is, he is somebody who's taking some Stoic ideas and making them contemporary. Talks about overcoming himself rather than fortune. So we're saying, look, the focus that I can have and have any real expectation of achieving something is this, myself. I don't really control whether I'm wealthy. I don't really control whether I'm famous. I don't really control whether people give me, nice positions or power. I don't really even control other people's, friendships or relationships with me, although I can certainly do a job if I want to be a jerk. They're not going to like me. But I do have control over myself. So if there's anything for me to conquer, if there's anything for me to master, to straighten out, to make right, it's myself, not all these other external circumstances. He goes further and he says that I should believe that there's nothing in our power except for our thoughts. This sounds very much like Stoics, like Epictetus, doesn't it? Now, when he talks about thoughts, he doesn't just mean thoughts that we have like, I'd like a sandwich, or red is the opposite of green, or things like that. He also means decisions, volitions. The will is part of our thinking being. And he also thinks about desires and feelings and all those as being thoughts, although oftentimes confused thoughts. Not the kind of thoughts that we want to put a lot of weight on as our decision makers. But we do have control over that. If we don't want to feel a certain way, we can think our way into feeling something different. Descartes would be going along with the Stoics on that. If we don't want to make dumb decisions, we can actually take the measures that we need to take so that we're actually well informed and we know that that decision is a bad decision and we go with that decision. So how would these rules play out in a person's life today? Imagine if you were living according to Descartes' provisional morality until you actually had things figured out. You probably would do okay, wouldn't you? You probably would not run into any trouble, and if you really wanted to do the Cartesian method and, break down everything and build it all back up from the ground up, this would be a pretty good way to live until you'd carried that out. And maybe you might cross off some of those, like you obey the laws and customs of the country afterwards. But until you've actually got everything set in place, that makes sense to do. All the rest of these help to keep a person on track, and so that's why Descartes is setting them out for himself.